Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here, and I'll tell you at the end why I think organizations like this are incredibly critical to preserving democracy. And I hope that my presentation will make that connection, and I'll bring it all back around. You know, as the information started to surface after the 2016 election, you know, I'll confess, I was kind of in fetal position for probably, 4 or 5 months. And then, I kind of emerged and said, look, this is our reality. And, but what happened? And then as we learned that there was actually foreign interference, that there were outside actors that were distorting our perceptions in our exercise of this very fundamental democratic activity, I approached it from a counterintelligence perspective. When you do counterintelligence investigations, so if you don't know, the FBI has a primary mandate to monitor foreign intelligence activity in the United States, and that involves identifying foreign agents, monitoring them, and neutralizing their activities, which is basically rendering them ineffective. But one thing that you do when you're looking at potential foreign intelligence activity is try to assess what is the vulnerability that they are exploiting. Because foreign intelligence services don't do an operation unless they see a vulnerability they can exploit. They don't recruit people unless they see a vulnerability that they can exploit. And in researching the vulnerability that I think that Russia saw, what became clear is that we can look at this as a foreign, interference problem, but this is also something that is self-created. And what I want to do in this presentation is to give you a way to understand what the problem is, how we can understand it, and then some thoughts on what we can do about it. And I'm going to confess up front, I'm working on that last one to make it a little bit more hopeful, because, it's always like, but I'm going to try to leave on an up note and with some constructive things that you can take away with you. All right. I hope this works.
Within the KGB is a department that specializes in planting false stories and forged documents to distort others' perception of reality. It is the department that deals in disinformation. Yuri Bezmenov is a former KGB agent.
Follows the statement of a very ancient Chinese philosopher, Sun Tzu, who was born 500 years BC, before Jesus Christ, who said something to the effect that fighting war on a battlefield is the most stupid and primitive way of fighting a war. The highest art of warfare is not to fight at all, but to subvert anything of value in your enemy's country, be it moral traditions, religion, respect to your authority and leaders, cultural traditions, anything. Put white against black, old against young, wealth against poor, and so on. Doesn't matter. As long as it disturbs society, as long as it cuts the moral fiber of a nation, it's good. And then you just take this country, when everything is subverted, when the country is disoriented and confused, when it is demoralized and then destabilized, then the crisis will come.
I know that's very ominous and a little creepy, but that is Yuri Bezmenov. He's a former KGB officer, and he defected here to the United States and went around giving a lot of lectures about how the KGB operates. You've heard the term active measures. Active measures is not a new term. This was basically a part of the KGB's arsenal of intelligence operations all during the Cold War. And one thing that made the KGB different than our CIA, for example, or other Western intelligence agencies, is that our intelligence agencies are primarily focused on intelligence collection. We go out there, our officers go out, they collect secrets, they collect information, they bring it back to our policymakers Yes, they do covert actions, but that is a small slice. It's done in kind of discrete, with discrete objectives. The KGB only used about 15% of its resources towards intelligence collection. The majority of its focus and resources, 85%, went towards subversion. And what Yuri Bezmenov is describing here was exactly that, is to go agitate countries internally, create divisions, sow chaos, and to essentially destabilize your enemy, which, under communist Soviet Union would then create a weakness that then you can come in and take over or whatever. So, okay. This theory has continued into Putin's Russia. And though it is not basically guided by an ideology like the KGB was under the Soviet Union, they still have this idea to use that internal destabilization as a tactic. And in many ways, under Putin's Russia, it's even more important because Putin understands, unlike kind of the Soviet Union postured itself, Putin acknowledges that Russia cannot compete with the United States militarily or economically or technologically. It cannot rise to meet the countries that it believes are its adversaries. So the way to fight your adversary is to bring your adversary down, to weaken it and divide it. And one place, what is new in the active measures that are used by Putin's Russia is that they have discovered that the information space is where they can wage war. This isn't about using traditional military tactics. This is about political warfare in the information space. And again, this is very different than the way we, for example, think about information warfare, which is kind of a very military tactic. You'll, go in the Defense Department and they have that, but it's used for military objectives. That is not the case in Russia. This is used basically against the civilian population, and we're seeing this not just here, but also in Europe. Oh, and this happy-looking gentleman here is General Valery Gerasimov, and this is what he was articulating in 2013, this idea of using the information space. And this is something that they have tested out in what they call the near abroad, before they launched like in the Ukraine, before they launched these information operations in the United States. So they were practicing. And what they finally did in the United States was basically a refinement of things that had already worked for them in countries that were closer to them. So how can we look at active measures in the 2016 election? Active measures, again, is not just one tactic. It's anything that can kind of create confusion, sow chaos, sow distrust among people in their institutions and the legitimacy of their elected leaders and their fellow citizens. So there are kind of four main strands. If you're following closely the news and you just feel like, this has more characters than War and Peace, and I just don't know where these people fit into it, I think this is a helpful framework for you to just think about where are these things happening. So the first is hacking and intrusion. This is primarily, the thing that's been in the news the most is the hacking of the Dmz Server. Robert Mueller, the special counsel, indicted 12 GRU military intelligence officers for conducting that hack. And the purpose here is not just to say, hey, you're insecure, you can't protect your information, but it's also to take that information and weaponize it, and to use it strategically to essentially manipulate people to reach the objectives that they want. And we see that they did that with their strategic release of the emails that they stole from the DNC. The second is illegal campaign contributions. And this is just really getting their tentacles into the political system. Under our election law, under our federal election law, foreign campaign contributions are illegal, but they can use straw donors or straw organizations. So when you're seeing things like, what was going on with Russia and the NRA, that might be a funnel where they would be able to use, a legitimate organization that, can exercise campaign contribution to political candidates to basically funnel money into our candidates' coffers. The third is political influence, and this is kind of interesting because this is something that is happening very overtly. These are basically Russian agents who are out in the open. They're talking to influential people, people with money, politicians. Maria Butina, if you remember, our friendly spy, who is also hanging out with the NRA and with other influential people, she would be basically an agent of influence, trying to ingratiate her way into circles and get people who are in positions of power and able to make decisions to kind of come onto the side of objectives that Russia wants to see. It could be politicians and getting them to be more favorable in their stance to Russia, lifting sanctions, that kind of thing. But it could be a wide range of foreign policy objectives. And then the last is disinformation and propaganda. And this is what I want to focus on in this presentation. So I'm not going to be talking about the first three, but I wanted you to see where the disinformation piece fits into the big picture. But the disinformation and propaganda is kind of the hardest to get our mind around because it's invisible. And it's hard to really understand how it's impacted us. There's nothing measurable. It's not like a terrorist attack. There aren't dead bodies and debris from buildings that you can count or look at. And so to get an understanding of the magnitude of the threat is really difficult. But actually, of all of these, I think it is the most dangerous threat that we face. Because with all of these other things, you can use prophylactic measures. You can strengthen campaign finance laws, you can strengthen up your infrastructure, but disinformation and propaganda is all about distorting people's perceptions, and that becomes much harder to do without people's awareness. So when I was in the FBI, most of the cases that I did were about perception, propaganda and disinformation by foreign agents. The FBI calls these perception management campaigns, and the idea is that a perception management operation is any operation by a foreign intelligence service that's designed to influence the attitudes or opinions of the target audience towards a particular issue. We have a presumption in favor of free speech, but we do want that speech to be transparent. And you probably heard a lot about the Foreign Agent Registration Act. That's a tool that's kind of made a comeback in the last couple of years. That's actually a law that was created and passed in 1938. And the intention behind that law was to counter Nazi propaganda. And what it does is it doesn't ban the content of the information, but it requires that if there is a foreign agent that is directing or controlling that information, it has to be disclosed so that the people who are consuming that information can understand the source of where their information is coming from. Now, when you're doing a perception management case as an FBI agent, you're kind of facing a tall battle because after the church hearings, I don't know if you all know what those are. That's, the congressional hearings that exposed a lot of unsavory things that J. Edgar Hoover was doing against US citizens inside the United States, spying on political activists, politicians, civil rights leaders. So from that came something called the Attorney General Guidelines, and those govern how the FBI can conduct investigations. And there is a huge protective bubble around anything that is First Amendment activity. Really, the only thing that the FBI can use is the Foreign Agent Registration Act, which is sort of warning people, you better go register, but there's not much else you can do. Now, I was conducting these investigations around 2002 to 2005, right before the internet and social media explosion. So this wasn't seen as that big of a threat, because when you're looking at analog media, I mean, it takes a long time, and it only has a limited reach. If a foreign government puts, a secret op-ed or article in a paper, its influence is only going to go as far as the readership of that paper. Now, this is not to say that it can't be successful. Under the KGB, one of their most successful disinformation operations was the rumor that the United States government created the AIDS virus. And the way that they did this was they first planted the story in India, another open society where they have a lot of free speech, so it makes it easier to do that. And it slowly got picked up by other outlets, migrated its way to Europe, got circulated in that media, and finally made it over the Atlantic Ocean, and was eventually actually broadcast, as a report by Dan Rather on the evening news. So they were able to mainstream that. Now, it took them, I think, 1.5 to 2 years. What's different now? Social media. So, social media creates a number of additional barriers. I've already talked about the First Amendment down at the bottom, and social media are these two bubbles on either side. First, unlike journalists that have their own professional ethics, when I was doing my investigations, if, say, there was a foreign spy or agent that was trying to target a journalist unwittingly to get them to be an unwitting mouthpiece for their interests, I might be able to quietly warn the journalist, your source might be a spy. And they are interested in their professional reputation, in the reputation of their outlets, and so they are going to take some ownership over what they are using. Social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook really style themselves as basically neutral platforms that have no responsibility for the content that they are putting out. And so there's no screening mechanism in terms of the content that's being put out. And that content can reach millions of people within hours. So that AIDS virus, operation that took 2 years could now just take overnight if they choose to do that. The other is that there's lack of regulation of the internet. Our laws do not treat the internet the same way that they do television and even radio. For example, with campaign ads, when you watch these political campaign ads, at the end they say, I'm so-and-so and I stand by this message. This is a law called the Stand By Your Ad Act, which requires people who are sponsoring political messages to actually disclose who is behind them. That does not apply online. And so those kinds of regulations, partly because I think our lawmakers are just not technologically savvy, have not been able to keep up. And I guess on that note, maybe I should just quickly ask, how many of you use Facebook? Okay, how many of you use Twitter? How many of you have no idea what these platforms do? Okay, all right, we'll walk through. I just wanted to kind of get, I don't want you to get lost in what I'm saying, but I mean, it is a generational thing. In fact, by the way, the youngest generation, Facebook is totally passé. They are not using it anymore. You're totally uncool if you're on it. So I'm just gonna let you know. So, these three things, the lack of regulation of the internet, the neutral platforms, the First Amendment, these are kind of really out of our control. They're, in the hands of lawmakers. They might be able to make a difference in, in the case of, say, regulation or political ad laws or whatever. But, the First Amendment actually is a huge benefit to countries like Russia that want to propagate disinformation, because we believe that speech ought to get more, that it's a marketplace of ideas, and it's never good to suppress speech. So we think that it will correct itself. The one thing that is self-created is the political polarization that exists in American society. And that is something that no law or regulation is going to address. But in my opinion, it's really the most critical factor of understanding how Russia was able to be so successful in basically circulating its disinformation, combined with the new technology. So I asked how many of you use Facebook. So one of the things about Facebook, for sure, but also Twitter, what it does is it allows you to curate a certain bubble of people whose opinions you will see. So you can, choose your friends, you can hide friends, you can choose to not friend people. Basically, who you choose to include in your circle is going to determine whose thoughts and preferences are going to show up in your feed and what you're reading. The other feature about them is that you can actually block or hide people that you just don't want to hear from. So when you see things that make you mad or that you disagree with, you can just cut them out and you don't have to listen to them. And this is a fundamental change in, I think, how we basically interact with ideas in the world. And you'll see that basically people who are at kind of have a strong political identity are most likely to kind of use these kinds of features. This is a really interesting chart by the Pew Research Center, which looks at political polarization over time. What I find really interesting about this, so they have the politically engaged at the top, the less politically engaged on the bottom, and they have 1994, 2004, and 2014. What I think is really interesting here is that if you look at the kind of widening triangles, the little triangle of shared views getting smaller, that differential is actually much greater between 2004 and 2014 than it is from 1994 to 2004. And they don't offer a cause or a correlation here, but I think it is notable that the internet and social media really came on the scene in about 2005. That was kind of when we started transitioning to using these platforms, getting our news on these platforms, and I don't think it's a coincidence that you see this dramatic shift, definitely when, again, people who have very strong political convictions, and that polarization happening. So you've probably heard about the Russian political ads during the election. If any of these showed up in your Facebook feed or Twitter feed, congratulations, you were targeted by Russian intelligence. But one of the things that Russia has figured out is that the way to divide people is through very emotionally charged issues. Giving some big manifesto about ideology is not going to be what is helpful. It's giving them some meme with Dora and making a point about immigration, because that's what gets people riled up. It's very simple. They can kind of react to it very immediately. These were all Russian-sponsored accounts, fake accounts on Facebook. And the fact that Russia is no longer constrained by a political ideology has actually freed them up more so than the KGB during the Cold War. Because the KGB was really targeting kind of a fringe left, the agitators, the people who were kind of rebelling against the system, because there was a natural affinity there in terms of where they might get people to get on board. They didn't make so much progress with the political right, with conservatives, because the Soviet Union was atheist. You weren't going to really be able to make that many inroads. It was communist. You had a very hard right, anti-communist stance. They don't have that constraint anymore. So now they're able to target both extremes and get them to basically fight against each other. And if you look at this one ad down in the middle, in the bottom, this is a United Muslims of America. Let's do a support Hillary, save American Muslims. Okay, that doesn't sound terrible. It doesn't sound, crazy. The thing is that that is an event. They created basically a rally or protest, to celebrate this one or in favor of this one idea on a particular date at a particular time in a particular place. And they targeted it towards people who would be likely to resonate with that and maybe show up. But what they also did was create another ad that had, Muslims are destroying America. Come out to save America from Muslims. And they would have it at the same place, at the same time, on the same date. And they literally were able to get people out. So this is kind of this is a success story for propaganda, when you get people from passively consuming information out and then screaming at each other, and you're just pulling the puppet strings. That is a huge coup for them. And this is kind of what they were doing in multiple places on various different issues. It's kind of terrifying. One of the things that they also did was plant false stories. And so this slide gives you a comparison of the top fake election stories compared to the top mainstream election stories. One of the things about social media platforms is that their algorithms and the way that their advertising model is set up, it rewards virality. In other words, the more it gets shared and circulated, it kind of builds on itself. And you'll see that the fake stories actually got read and shared and circulated more than the real stories. And I also want to point out, in this vein of being able to get people to go from passive consumption to action, that Pizzagate story, which was actually created by some right-wing nut, but the bots and trolls, which I will explain in a second, helped amplify it to a point where someone picked up a gun and went into that pizza parlor and shot people. Again, in terms of the goals of active measures, that is a success story for them. Okay, bots and trolls. So you have Russia, these Russian fake accounts. You also have bots and trolls, which are basically either automated accounts or people that are employed basically to amplify the content that Russia wants to see circulating within particular bubbles. If you want to read just something that's fascinating and both terrifying, you've heard of this troll farm in St. Petersburg. This troll farm, and the owner, who is an oligarch that is close to Putin, was also indicted by special counsel along with 2 other companies and 13 Russian nationals. They're in court right now. And this is literally an office building. They employ people. You go to work. You are a troll. You are a paid troll. You sit down. You have quotas. You're supposed to get online. You find people. You argue with them. You harass them. You insult them. Hopefully, if it's somebody that is giving a message that is against what they want really out there, you try to chill that speech. If they're saying something incredibly hateful or divisive, you amplify that. And they work in 12-hour shifts. There's a great New York Times article. They apparently don't get lunch. They take smoke breaks. And they're required to basically tweet a certain number of things or amplify a certain number of things every day. This is their job. And this is what their intelligence services are actually focusing their resources on. What this photo shows, the blue dots are real accounts. The red dots are fake accounts. They're bots and trolls. How big the dot is how much they are amplifying content. And these 2 hashtags are basically, in Twitter, you can hashtag something, and so it kind of keeps it in a particular category. You can see that these hashtags are not intersecting. I'm with her versus Make America Great Again. And so you have this viral content basically ricochet within each of these political bubbles without any kind of interaction. So it's just a visual depiction of what is happening on the internet. Okay, so that's the problem. And so how do we understand it? It's kind of terrifying, it feels really big, but how do we make sense of this? And one of the things that I felt really helped me make sense of what Russia was doing is a book called Bowling Alone by a Harvard professor named Robert Putnam. And this is a book that talks about social capital in America. Social capital is how we create relationships with each other. And he didn't coin this term. This is something that political scientists and sociologists had been talking about for a while. But Putnam's contribution was to basically say, we create social capital in two primary ways, through bridging and through bonding. Which one do I have first? Okay, so bonding is when we create relationships with people who are like us, with people with whom we have a particular affinity. It might be religion, it might be some kind of shared background, but these are typically homogenous communities. They're very tightly knit. They provide a sense of social security. They can leverage shared strengths. They provide a lot of benefits. I would say a good example of bonding social capital are ethnic communities, ethnic immigrant communities. I mean, when my parents came to the United States from India in 1970, they literally tried to find every Indian who lived within a 60-mile radius. And became friends with all 10 of them. And then we would, maybe once a month or once every couple of months, all get together. That is bonding social capital. Bridging social capital is when we create relationships with people who are different than us. When we basically, forge relationships that cross these kind of social cleavages, like race or class or religion or other kinds of things that we might ordinarily bond over. What is good about bridging social capital is that it allows ideas to travel faster and farther. Because basically you have an idea and it's going from one group to another where it might not have ever been generated by that group alone. And so it fosters innovation that is the benefit to that. To bridging social capital, I would say universities are an example of bridging social capital. That's what they aspire to achieve by bringing people from all over the country together in a classroom or in a department to share ideas. Now, here's the thing, is that there are negative externalities that are associated with bonding social capital, more so than with bridging social capital, Putnam says. In particular, when you have too much bonding social capital at the expense of bridging social capital, what you get is tribalism. You get factions, you get policies based on mistrust, people trying to keep people out because people feel that what their identity and allegiance is to this in-group that they belong to. And this has major implications for social trust. Because Putnam also says we have two kinds of social trust. We have generalized social trust, he calls it thin trust, or when we have specific social trust, or thick trust. Thick trust is when we're in a tight group, you did something for me, I'm going to do something for you because we know each other and I have this personal relationship with you. Generalized social trust is, I don't know you, but I just have your back because we just kind of share this community together. And I would say that, if you can remember that ethos that was there right after 9/11 and how people responded, that sense of connection that you had to people you didn't know because we were just sharing this pain together or just this country together, that is an example of thin, generalized social trust. And when you get this kind of imbalance, that kind of generalized social trust goes down. This is just another breakdown of bridging and bonding, for your reference, if you want to ask about it later. So on social trust, the General Social Survey has been asking since 1972 the question, do you think most Americans can be trusted? As of, I think it was 2015 or 2016, it was at 30% who answered yes, the lowest since they started asking the question in 1972, which by the way was not like, a great, time for a lot of, faith in government and in what was going on. So I think it really says something about how people view their fellow citizens. So Putnam asked, okay, so we know this, and what he says is that it's declining, and that it's been declining since World War II. Okay? Quick note, Putnam writes this in 2000. And so he's not addressing the internet yet. He was kind of throwing some things out there about, what he thought might happen, but he was not looking at the implications. But he says a lot of things that I think we can draw some conclusions from. First, he says, it's been declining since World War II, and part of the reason, he says, is just generational. That we have these generational cohorts that just see government, the country, each other differently. And that as this social capital has gone down, so have levels of civic engagement. People are voting less. They don't write letters to congressmen anymore. They're not reading the paper. And so he goes through and he kind of notes on some of the characteristics of the different generations. And he talks about the World War II generation as the civic generation. And these are people who were less formally educated, but lived through a war where there was basically this very shared ideal of what we were fighting for and what we were fighting against. And people who were more connected to their communities, to civic institutions, a lot of engagement in associations, civic associations, the PTA, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, all of that stuff. Then you get the boomers. They ruin everything. They have a lot of civic engagement during Vietnam. I mean, they actually are, protesting and, engaging in all of these ways with what the government is doing. But then you see their civic engagement also drop off. They are more educated than the civic generation, but they have a little bit of the rejection of authority, the distrust of government that starts to come in there, and more of this idea of individualism. Then you get Gen X. I'm Gen X. The me generation. And this is a very individualistic generation. This is all about me. There's no real collective political event that everybody shares. Starting to get into computers, we're kind of straddling that. And interestingly, this is the generation where you see these, the lines of the rates of suicide and depression cross. It used to be that older people had higher rates of suicide than younger people. But starting around Gen X, you see that the rates start to go up among younger generation and start to drop among lower generation, or the younger, start to drop among the older generation. So he accounts for some of the decline in social capital, social trust, civic engagement due to these kind of generational changes, but he says that's not all of it. There is something else. And that something else he identifies as television. What he observes is that starting with the advent of television, people start retreating. They are no longer out checking, going by front porches and saying hi to their neighbors. They're retreating into their living rooms. And the biggest factor about the television that influenced civic engagement was whether they were using the television for news or for entertainment. And the more that they moved to television as a source of entertainment, you start to see this lack of civic engagement, people being less connected to each other, people spending more, even as they're getting more leisure time because of working hours and stuff changing, using more of that leisure time in these very confined settings with just the people that they know and not really out in civic associations and other places where they're going to meet other people. And just on that idea of technology, this is, I love this chart. This is a chart about different technologies and how long it took for that technology to saturate 75% of households. And you can see there's a lot going on here, but you know, you look at things like the radio, for example. You have a pretty long arc. But as you start moving over into more recent technology, color TV takes less time. And you get to things like the computer, cell phone, internet. Hardly any time to basically saturate 75% of households. Why does this matter? It means that these technologies start to take over more people more quickly. And I think in the case of internet and social media, it gives them less time to understand the impact of the technology and kind of respond to it. Before they know what the damaging aspects can be, everybody's already using it, which is pretty much what we've now discovered with Facebook and Twitter. This is another slightly depressing trend, broken down by generation in terms of where people are getting their source of news. And again, Putnam was writing just at the cusp of the internet explosion, but he was seeing evidence that the more people are getting their news from the internet, the less they are civically engaged or creating social capital. Why getting it online versus reading a paper? I think it's probably, my guess would be that it's also correlated with just the amount of time people are spending online. We spend an average of 6.5 hours a day online, about a third of that on social media. So if you imagine that that's a big chunk of your day, a third of your time getting opinions, by the way, or news that you have personally curated to your own preferences, to the exclusion of ideas that might disagree with yours. Let's see. Baby boomers are still much more opposed. So what is tribalism? What does it do besides like lowering social trust? How does it work? So this is a phenomenon. I'm just going to go through a few kind of different ideas that are out there that might spark your interest if you want to look into this more. Direct and motivated reasoning. This is some research that's being done by political scientists. And this is the idea that once you belong to a tribe, when you ascribe to ideas, it's not so much about your belief in those ideas as it is signaling your membership in that tribe. So this is studies that are trying to understand, why do people believe fake news, even when they're presented evidence and facts that are telling them that it's false? And it's because it's not really about whether they believe it, in fact. It's because believing it makes them a part of this group of people who are all on board with what this tribe says. And that is what's going to matter, that social acceptance is what matters more than the facts itself. The information is a marker of tribal identity, and as that identity becomes more and more based on political identity, you can see how, we see how certain values that may have been held by a political party have changed in recent times. Like, well, that doesn't make any sense. That's not what conservatives didn't stand for. For example, executive power overreach. It's a difficult problem now because now they can't just decide on that principle. They are also making a statement about their membership in the tribe. And I think this is what the vote on the emergency powers is really coming down to. It's also influencing, we talked about generations earlier, how people see democracy. These are some scary statistics. So after the travel ban ruling, the survey on whether you trust Trump or judges to make decisions to make right decisions. Basically, like, do you trust our independent judiciary to rule on legal issues? Only 53%, and this is not just Trump supporters. This is everybody surveyed trust judges more than Trump. 38% trust Trump more than judges. 9% were undecided on that question. And this one was the big kicker on the importance of living in a democracy. So in answering the question, is it essential to live in a democracy? 72% of those born before World War II said, yeah, it's important. Only 33% of millennials, those born between 1980 and I think 1994, said that it's important. So, I think that these are statistics that we have to pay attention to because they're related to this idea of civic engagement, of understanding why our institutions are important, why democracy matters. If people are participating in it, they probably don't understand the value of it, and are probably willing to kind of defer those decisions and to somebody else. And I think that's what we're seeing. So I'm gonna get to the hopeful part. I have a few slides that get more hopeful, but I wanted to, got a picture here of, I call them Daryl and Daryl, and they're wearing a shirt, if you can't read it, that says, I'd rather be Russian than Democrat. And I think this kind of encapsulates the tribalism and the directed motivated thinking and the almost openness to autocracy that I've been describing. And it's scary, quite frankly, right? Because, and you can switch out, whatever political party you belong to, but the idea that you would say, I would rather be in an oppressive country that tramples on people's civil liberties and where people don't even have basic goods, rather than be a member of just an opposing idea, a political idea, really says a lot about where we are right now. This, by the way, in intelligence terms is called convergence. Again, another win for Putin because basically they have gotten people to think this on their own. They literally went out and bought the t-shirt. So, this is, something to think about, but I have hopeful news. I know you're like, oh, Reagan is the hopeful news, but he is. On that research on directed motivated thinking, this idea that you care more about your membership in the tribe than the facts or what you actually believe in, the research shows that when you can appeal to people's civic mindedness, when you can basically talk about shared values that transcend political or policy differences, people are more likely to be open to basically bridging with other people. And I think that we've kind of lost sight of that in these highly polarized policy debates, which are important, and in many cases they can be life or death for some people, but at the same time, we haven't spent enough time countering the messages that Russia is doing and that we're kind of amplifying on our own with this idea that we have a shared collective identity and shared values. And I think Reagan's farewell speech to me really encapsulates some of what we've lost. And I don't even think we've noticed it, but I think his farewell speech is a good example. By the way, I did not add the music to this.
And that's about all I have to say tonight, except for one thing. The past few days, when I've been at that window upstairs, I've thought a bit of the shining city upon a hill. The phrase comes from John Winthrop, who wrote it to describe the America he imagined. What he imagined was important because he was an early pilgrim, an early freedom man. He journeyed here on what today we call a little wooden boat, and like the other pilgrims, He was looking for a home that would be free. I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. A city with great ports that hung with commerce and creativity. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get there. That's how I saw it and see it still. And how stands the city on this winter night? More prosperous, more secure, and happier than it was 8 years ago. But more than that, after 200 years, 2 centuries, she's still staying strong and true on the Granite Ridge, and her glow is held steady, no matter what storm. And she's still a beacon, still a magnet for all who must have freedom, for all the pilgrims from all the lost places who are hurtling through the darkness toward home. We've done our part, and as I walk off into the city streets, a final word to the men and women of the Reagan Revolution, the men and women across America who for 8 years did the work that brought America back. My friends, we did it. We weren't just marking time. We made a difference. We made the city stronger. We made the city freer. And we left it in good hands. All in all, not bad. Not bad at all. And so, goodbye. God bless you. And God bless the United States of America.
I know, we love Reagan now. But you know, that's the kind of rhetoric that we had, even in a time when we were divided. This idea that there was an identity that we all belong to. And I think that, you know, that is where, whether it's this, kind of collective identity as people from all over the globe who come here, or about values like rule of law, like separation of powers, these very fundamental, freedoms and rights that we have. I think those can be unifying principles, and unfortunately, right now, I think the news cycle is just so fast that we can't find the space to articulate those. But I am hopeful that we will see more of that moving forward. Stuck. Okay, and so the other kind of hopeful thing is that a lot of this, as I mentioned, is self-created, and it's really a lot about our own behaviors and how we choose to spend our time, how we choose to interact with each other. I think the very fact that you are here, this is exactly the kind of association or membership-based group that Putnam's basically chronicles the decline of. So the fact that this is active and that people are coming out to listen to these kinds of things and talk to other people is really a good sign. But this is also, kind of a social media diet that, if more people followed, might also help. And, maybe something like this is something that schools would start to actually add as part of their education, digital and media literacy for kids. So that's basically it. This is a long quote from Tocqueville, which you can read at your leisure, but I am happy to answer any questions that you have about pieces in this presentation, or thoughts or feedback, or,
Great, thank you so much. We'll be taking questions.
Hi, my name is Jackie Keiko. I don't mean to be negative, but why are you hopeful?
Yeah. Why am I hopeful? I am hopeful because I actually think, as a lawyer, understanding kind of how our government was set up, that it was really set up with this in mind. And what we are seeing is a test of the mechanisms that are in place to keep our government running and protect people's rights. And I mean, as a former FBI agent, I'm really proud of the Department of Justice and the FBI that even in the face of someone who totally ignores all the norms of the office, who's basically like obstructing justice every 2 seconds on Twitter, you know, that they have been able to continue this investigation. He has not been able to fire his way out of it or pardon his way out of it. And I think that really speaks to a strength of our law enforcement, our judiciary, which I think has stepped in many instances to reassert first principles of you know, what our Constitution says. So I, you know, the protests, I mean, that women's march, you know, very early on, I mean, I think these kinds of things that we're not paying attention to as signals that, you know, there is strength here that suggests that we have the resilience to make it through. I think focusing on what's wrong can lead to apathy and people just checking out. And I think that is the most dangerous thing.
I think one of the things that we should also look at is that this isn't just an American problem. It's a Western democracy problem. And what seems to have happened is that in the good times, before globalization, the electorate were quite happy to outsource the political governance of a country to a political careerist class, which has in fact failed. And what we have now is a crisis of leadership. We don't have any decent leaders. The only hope I see for the future is in someone like Emmanuel Macron, who seems to typify an intellectual depth that is currently missing on both sides of the Atlantic. Do you agree with that, or do you think that's opposite?
I think what you're saying is that we don't have statesmen anymore. That's the word I would use. And I think, you know, like John McCain was a statesman, right? Like you could disagree with his policies or where he stood on a particular issue, but he had a commitment to those first principles. I mean, I don't think you could doubt that. And I think that idea of statesmanship has been lost. But I also think that there, you know, some of the root of that, you know, is how our, you know, you are signing up for a world of pain and hurt when you run for office, and not, I think the best people choose not to be honest. I also think that we don't have enough civic education where that becomes something that that children aspire to do. That, you know, they want to go out and be the next, you know, Mark Zuckerberg. They are not, you know, I mean, maybe some of them are like, I want to be president, but I just don't see that being kind of the aspirational model. So I think there's a number of things, but I would agree. I would say that we don't have statesmen anymore, which is what we used to have, or at least more of them. I've got one up here.
Mr. Gaffa, thank you for being here today at the First Library, and congratulations on your project on Russia and the U.S. I'm Kieran Edmondson, and I'm currently a member of the Democrats of Western Connecticut and a member of the World Affairs Forum. So, when it comes to the Russian government and who has been responsible for interfering in the 2016 election back in 2016, as they tried to do the same thing just back in November 2018 during the midterms, as they tried to do the same thing for the future. And if you were still a member part of the FBI as of right now, would you do everything that you possibly can do to make sure that the Russians, including Putin and those who are part of it, do not have the right to be undermining our democracy and destroying our maps and hurting people's voting procedures, and by working with the U.S. Congress, the Homeland Security Council, and the CIA and the National Security Council, by doing anything you can to make sure that the United States is safe from those people who are trying to interfere in our system, and to protect the voters' rights in our country, and to make sure that everyone has a right to be voting in every election that matters to all of us.
Yes, thank you for that question. I would absolutely be doing everything. And I think what you see is a lot of frustration So I think the question is really what should and what can our agencies, Department of Homeland Security, FBI, CIA, be doing to prevent this kind of interference from happening? And this is not consistent with my wanting to end on a good note because we are not doing much. I can tell you that. I think that there is a consensus among the intelligence community, but ultimately a coordinated policy and action plan of how to combat Russian election interference has to come from the top. And right now, the President of the United States believes that it's a hoax. So this is not, the Congress allocated $80 million to combating disinformation to the State Department, which sat completely untouched. It's still sitting there. They haven't spent this money. The Department of Homeland Security doesn't, as far as I'm aware, have a coordinated strategy of reaching out to states and shoring up their election infrastructure and understanding the weaknesses in voting systems, which are all at the state level. So, yes, I would be doing everything that I could, but unfortunately, that is something, the President doesn't even really meet with the Security Council, National Security Council. So that's where policy is made and it's disseminated to these agencies, and unfortunately, that's not happening, which is kind of why I like to frame this as something about what we can do, because I think, again, it can feel very hopeless when you leave it in the hands of, when is the government going to fix this? And I think even if they took steps, that would not obviate the need for us to take a good look at what we are doing within America's democratic social fabric.
Hi. I want to go back to the very beginning of your presentation, where you talked about how the other Western countries were attacked by the Soviet, or at that point, Russian disinformation. And I understand that Estonia has had wonderful programs against disinformation. They've been very successful. I know nothing about Estonia, except I understand that it's not this horrible divided system that we have, where half of the country believes there's no problem at all, and others feel that there is a great difficulty. So what did they do? What are some of the very specific things that they did which they were very successful in turning around this disinformation? Or other examples if you don't want to talk about Estonia.
Yeah, no, there have been several examples, and really it's about basically a public education campaign, media literacy and digital literacy campaign about propaganda. I mean, here's what kind of the punchline that I didn't tell you about FBI investigations on propaganda. I mentioned that when you're investigating foreign intelligence services, your goal is to neutralize their activities, and that can take a number of different forms depending on what they're doing. When it comes to propaganda and disinformation, the way you neutralize it is to expose it, to make it transparent. That was the point of the Foreign Agent Registration Act, to make Nazi propaganda, like, this is from the Nazis, guys. People are going to be more skeptical of it. So they have a coordinated strategy of educating people that this is happening, that it's out there, and how to address it. And we don't. I think that the fact that Robert Mueller indicted that troll farm and the 13 Russian nationals, it's not because he thought he's going to get them into court or go to jail. He did it because that indictment is what is known as a speaking indictment. It provides more information than he needed to provide to substantiate that indictment. And what it is we keep asking about, well, we're going to see the Mueller report. Yeah, that's part of the Mueller report. He is putting that out there so that the public can understand what Russia did and how they did it. Things like they were posting different events on Facebook for people to show up at the same time and scream at each other. That's in there. But how many people are reading Mueller's indictment? I think we need really like a PSA, like posters of read before you share or whatever. I mean, you used to have that in World War II, it was like loose lips, sink ships, those things, like something where it is sort of a common enterprise. Like, this is something we're all fighting together, check your source. I mean, something kind of catchy that just kind of keeps in people's minds that this is something that is happening and being done to us from the outside. that people can rally around. But again, it's very hard when you have, the person that everybody listens to and that the media pays attention to saying every day that it's a hoax.
Hello, my name is Ward Abel, and I'm a teacher. I teach high school, and I have a question about a word that you use to describe the way we are kind of divided, and that word is tribalism and tribes. I'm wondering how is that different than, how is being tribal different than subscribing to a political ideology or just being partisan? And is one aware of the tribe that he or she may be in? And then finally, how do we interact with people who may be in a different tribe than us and have a conversation about something which we disagree?
Yeah, okay, there's a lot of questions, and I think I'll be able to address them. So I think the difference between tribalism and, adhering to a political ideology is that when you are actually about a political ideology, you've thought about the principles and beliefs of that ideology, you measure them against your own value system or behavior, you find that you agree with them, and you decide that this is the party that best aligns with my beliefs. In other words, your beliefs, your own values, kind of come first, and then you choose based on that. I think tribalism really tribalism is about social membership. It's really about belonging to people that, you may not actually believe in what it supposedly stands for, but you are either in or you're out, and you would rather be in. And for that, you are going to, just take on the agenda of that group. That's kind of the difference that I see. As far as, I don't remember your second question. Yeah, so, I didn't add this into this presentation. I've done it before because there's a whole other part of research that I drew from relationship research. John Gottman is a relationship psychologist. He was in Malcolm Gladwell's Blink. He's the guy who can watch a couple argue for 5 minutes and predict with 95% certainty whether or not they'll get divorced based on how they're arguing. So, he's quite good. But one of the things he says about relationships is that, with each person that you're in a relationship with, you have an emotional bank account. And whenever you do something that is nice, you have a positive interaction with them, you are making a deposit in that bank account. And then when you have a negative interaction, you have a fight, you're making a withdrawal from that bank account. The problem, he says, is that you actually need more deposits to equal one withdrawal. Specifically, you need 5 positive interactions to actually even out kind of the withdrawal that you make in the trust in the relationship. He's talking about trust when you have a fight. And I think that applies at a broader level. I don't think that the way that you have a conversation is to actually talk about the things that you're fighting about. And that's why I think these things like, you can bond over your shared sports team. And you know what? If you're doing that, you probably don't know or care what they think about the wall, right? That's why these kind of actualizing things, when you go out to see theater or art or sports, what Putnam would call schmoozing, when you're just out kind of socializing, those are really important ways of forming social capital, because you're actually finding things that you can have in common with people, and you're not making those withdrawals. I think, the question is, how can we find ways to do that? And these kinds of forums are like that. I mean, I don't know where people sit on the political spectrum, but everybody's sitting here listening, and they're asking questions, and maybe they'll leave, and they'll reject it or not, but, we're all here not screaming at each other. So that's, I think, where we need to go, is to build that social trust, not over political issues.
And this will be the last question.
In your estimation, is there such a thing as the deep state?
Oh, yeah, the deep state. Yeah, we have meetings every Wednesday. We rotate who brings the donuts. Yeah, I think, honestly, anyone who has worked in the government, the idea of a deep state is so preposterous. I mean, I'm just wondering, like, how many triplicate forms does it take, the deep state to actually execute its conspiracy? And, how many times will the person approving it, reject it and send it back because you forgot to, fill out the right, the amount of bureaucracy that we have in the government really precludes the idea that there is some cabal somewhere. I mean, if anything, our government moves too slow. They can't get things done. They're not, we're left wondering after 9/11, like, how did these intelligence agencies miss this and not get it together? Well, it's because there's just a lot of, people, one side doesn't know what the other side is doing. So I don't believe there's a deep state. I also don't believe the FBI are like claiming left-wing liberals. That's really weird to me because that was not my experience. But I know that is kind of it's fun for people to imagine, I guess.